The low country of South Carolina has a way of keeping secrets. The air there sits thick and heavy, even in winter, humid, moss-draped, ancient. The rivers move slowly, as if they too are reluctant to leave. The land is beautiful in the way that only places soaked in tragedy can be, hauntingly, achingly beautiful. And somewhere between the Edisto River and the outer edges of Colleton County, surrounded by fields of white cotton that stretched to the horizon like a frozen sea, stood Whitmore Manor. It was built in 1831, 3 stories of whitewashed brick. 6 Greek columns across the front facade, each one wide enough for a man to wrap his arms around and still not touch his own hands. A grand staircase of Carolina pine led up to double doors painted black, a choice that locals always found unsettling, though no one dared say so to Colonel Harlan Whitmore's face. They said the house could be seen from 2 miles away on a clear day. They also said that on certain nights, when the wind came in from the marshes, you could hear things coming from inside those walls that had no reasonable explanation. This is the story of the man who lived there. The man who owned that land, those fields, and over 80 human souls. The man who sat in the front pew of First Baptist Church of Walterboro every single Sunday, hat in hand, eyes forward, lips moving in prayer. And this is the story of how, in the end, even God stopped listening. The year was 1847. The state of South Carolina was, by many accounts, the beating heart of the American plantation system. Charleston, just 40 miles east of Colleton County, was one of the wealthiest cities in the entire nation. Its grand boulevards lined with ironwork balconies, its harbor busy with ships carrying cotton, indigo, and rice to markets in Europe and the American North. But that wealth had a foundation, and that foundation was built on the backs of men, women, and children who had no say in any of it. Harlan Whitmore was 53 years old. A tall man, broad-shouldered with silver hair, he kept oiled back and a thick moustache that made his expressions difficult to read. He had inherited Whitmore Manor from his father, who had inherited it from his, and in the 17 years since taking full ownership of the property, Harlan had expanded it considerably, adding the east and west wings, commissioning the chapel at the rear of the property, and nearly doubling the number of enslaved people forced to work his land. He was a widower. His wife, Catherine, had died of fever in 1839, leaving him with 2 children, Thomas, then 12, and Eleanor, then 9. The people of Walterboro and the surrounding communities of the South Carolina Low Country regarded Harlan with a complicated mixture of fear and admiration. He was powerful. He was disciplined. He donated generously to the local church and to the fund that paved the main road through town. And he never, not once, spoke of the things that happened behind his gates, because behind those gates, Whitmore Manor operated on a logic entirely its own. The enslaved people on the property lived in a row of wooden cabins set behind the main house, past the kitchen garden and the smokehouse, where the land dipped slightly before leveling out into the cotton fields. The cabins were small, 4 walls, a dirt floor, a single window without glass. In summer, the low country heat was merciless, pressing down on everything like a physical weight. In winter, the cold that came off the marshes was wet and cutting, the kind of cold that settles inside the bones and refuses to leave. The overseer, a lean, humorless man named Dale Pruitt, originally from Barnwell County, was responsible for enforcing the daily schedule. And Dale Pruitt had a reputation that preceded him across 3 counties. But the man who truly kept Whitmore Manor running was not Dale Pruitt. His name was Ezra. No last name was recorded anywhere in the plantation's ledgers because the law of South Carolina in 1847 did not require one. He was approximately 40 years old, though no one knew his exact birthday, not even Ezra himself. He was of medium height, lean and composed, with large, careful hands and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, without appearing to look at anything in particular. He had taught himself to read using discarded pages from the Walterboro Gazette and the worn King James Bible that had been left behind in the kitchen by one of Harlan's house staff. He managed the harvest records, supervised the distribution of supplies, and quietly negotiated disputes between workers in ways that prevented them from escalating to Dale Pruitt's attention, which always meant escalating to pain. Harlan knew exactly how valuable Ezra was. He also knew exactly how dangerous that value made him. "A man who thinks is useful," Harlan once told his son Thomas on the porch of the manor one evening as the fireflies began rising from the cotton fields. "But a man who thinks and knows he's useful, that man you watch very carefully." Thomas was 20 years old in 1847, recently returned from 2 years at the College of Charleston, and he had come back with ideas that made his father deeply uncomfortable. Not radical ideas, not yet, but questions about efficiency, about the future of the plantation economy, about what he had read in certain northern newspapers that found their way into the college library. Harlan did not like questions. Eleanor at 18 was quieter than her brother, at least on the surface. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's iron spine, and she spent most of her days in the upper east room of the manor, which she had converted into a kind of private library, filling shelf after shelf with books ordered from a merchant in Charleston. She spoke little at dinner. She watched everything. Life at Whitmore Manor in the summer of 1847 moved at the slow, suffocating rhythm of the low country heat. Cotton was in the ground. The days were long. The nights were louder than you might expect. Insects, frogs from the nearby wetlands, and sometimes, if the wind shifted, the sound of voices carrying from the cabins, soft and low, in languages and cadences that the white residents of the manor could not fully understand, but could not entirely ignore. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late July, a group of 7 newly enslaved people arrived at the gates of Whitmore Manor, purchased at auction in Charleston. Most of them were young. Most of them were terrified. They stepped off the wagon into the brutal midday sun of Colleton County, looking at the white columns of the manor the way you look at something when you are trying to memorize it. Not because it is beautiful, but because you understand, on some level you cannot yet articulate, that this place is now your entire world. One of them was different. She was a woman of perhaps 50, though she carried herself with a stillness that made her age difficult to determine. Her name, they were told, was Miriam. She had been brought from a plantation outside of Beaufort, South Carolina, a coastal community deep in the Sea Islands, where the Gullah culture had survived for generations, where the African roots of language and spiritual practice had been preserved in ways that the rest of South Carolina barely understood. Miriam said almost nothing on the day she arrived. She looked at the cabins, she looked at the fields, she looked at the manor. And then, in a moment that Dale Pruitt would describe later to anyone who would listen, always with the same uneasy laugh, she looked directly at Harlan Whitmore, who was standing on the top step of the front porch, watching the new arrivals with his arms crossed, and she said, in a voice that carried clearly across the yard, "This house is already empty. You just haven't noticed yet." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Dale Pruitt stepped forward, and Harlan raised one hand slightly, just barely, to stop him. He stared at Miriam for a long moment, then he turned and walked back inside, and the black doors closed behind him. That night, for the first time in years, Harlan Whitmore did not sleep. "Now, before we move forward, we want to hear from you. Do you have family members or ancestors who lived through this era of American history in South Carolina or anywhere in the Deep South? Share your story in the comments below, and if this kind of history matters to you, please subscribe to this channel. This community is built by people who believe these stories deserve to be told and remembered. August came to Colleton County the way it always did, without mercy. The cotton was high now, chest level in the fields, white bolls beginning to split open under a sun that hung over the South Carolina low country like something punishing. The Edisto River, brown and slow, moved through the cypress swamps to the west of the property with the indifference of something ancient. Herons stood motionless in the shallows. The air smelled of mud and heat, and something faintly sweet that was either the cotton or the rot beneath it, depending on which way the wind was blowing. Harlan had not spoken of what Miriam said to him, but those who knew him well, and there were few who truly did, noticed a change. He began appearing in the kitchen before dawn, standing at the back window with a cup of coffee, looking out toward the cabins. He attended church in Walterboro the following 2 Sundays, but sat through the sermons without his usual rigid attention, his eyes moving to the middle distance, his lips still. He also began watching Miriam. She had been assigned to the laundry and the kitchen garden, and she performed both tasks without complaint and without particular haste, at a pace that suggested she was doing exactly what she chose to do and nothing more. She spoke to the other enslaved women in low, fluid tones. She knew the names of plants that no one else on the property recognized. At night, several of the cabin residents later reported she would sit outside her door after the others had gone in, looking up at the sky over the Carolina low country with an expression that was not sadness, not anger, not resignation, but something closer to patience. As if she were waiting for something she already knew was coming. It was Thomas who first spoke to her. Not because his father had asked him to, but because he was drawn to her in the way that young people are sometimes drawn to those who possess a quality they cannot name but desperately want to understand. He had been walking the perimeter of the property one evening, something he did when his thoughts grew too loud, and he found Miriam sitting on the low fence at the edge of the kitchen garden, looking west toward where the last light was draining out of the South Carolina sky. "You're not afraid of anything, are you?" Thomas said. It was not really a question. Miriam looked at him for a moment before answering. "Fear is for people who still believe they have something left to lose," she said. "I know exactly what I have, and I know exactly what cannot be taken." Thomas stood there for a long time after that, long after Miriam had gone back inside, thinking about what she meant. And over the following weeks, he returned to those conversations, tentatively at first, then with growing regularity. He began spending time near the work areas where Ezra supervised. He asked questions about the harvest, about the logistics of the property, about how things actually functioned beneath the official structure that his father and Dale Pruitt maintained. Ezra answered him carefully, not coldly, but with a precision that made clear he understood the risk of every word. What neither of them knew was that Eleanor had been watching all of this from her window on the Upper East Side of the manor. Eleanor Whitmore had always been the quieter storm. While Thomas asked questions out loud, Eleanor asked them silently, and then went looking for the answers herself. In the late summer of 1847, while reorganizing a storage room on the second floor of the manor's west wing, she found a locked chest beneath a false panel in the floor. It took her 3 days to find a key that fit. What she found inside would change everything she thought she knew about the Whitmore name. The chest contained letters, dozens of them, spanning more than 2 decades, written between Harlan's father, Aldous Whitmore, and a man named Gerald Croft, a land speculator originally from Savannah, Georgia. The letters detailed a series of transactions that, read plainly, described a crime of staggering proportions: the fraudulent acquisition of over 400 acres of land in Colleton County, land that had been legally purchased and titled by a free black family named the Beaumonts, one of a small number of free black landowners in the South Carolina Low Country in the 1820s. The Beaumonts had been systematically and illegally driven from their land through forged documents, false debt claims, and, in at least one letter, something far worse that was referred to only as the arrangement, with no further detail. The land the Beaumont family had lost was the eastern section of what was now Whitmore Manor's cotton fields. Eleanor read the letters twice. Then she locked them back in the chest, replaced the false panel, and sat in her room for the rest of the day without lighting a candle. In the dark, listening to the sounds of the manor around her, the creak of the floors, the distant voices from the cabins, the low country wind moving through the Spanish moss in the oaks outside. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the property that no one was talking about openly, but everyone was aware of. Miriam had begun, in the hours after her work was done, conducting what could only be described as ceremonies, quiet gatherings in the open space behind the last cabin after dark, when the main house lights had gone down. No fire. That would have drawn attention. Just a circle of people sitting in the South Carolina night, and Miriam's voice, low and rhythmic, speaking in a cadence that mixed English with something older, something rooted in the Gula traditions of the Sea Islands, something that connected the people in that circle to a spiritual lineage that had survived the Middle Passage, the auction blocks of Charleston, and every attempt to sever it. Word reached Harlan through one of the house staff, a young woman named Bet, who had been on the property since childhood, and whose loyalty to the Whitmore family was, depending on how you looked at it, either genuine or the only strategy available to her. Harlan listened to Bet's account without expression. Then he dismissed her and sat alone in his study for over an hour. That night he went to the chapel he had built at the rear of the property, a small, whitewashed structure with 4 wooden pews and a simple cross above the door, and he knelt and prayed with a fervor that, by his own account in his private journal, he had not felt since the death of his wife. He prayed for clarity. He prayed for the restoration of order. What he got instead was fire. It began sometime after midnight on the 14th of September, 1847. The origin point appeared to be the East Storage Building, a large wooden structure adjacent to the main cotton processing area, filled at that time of year with harvesting equipment, burlap sacking, and highly flammable cotton debris. By the time anyone in the main house was awake and responding, a quarter of the structure was already gone, and the fire was reaching toward the adjacent outbuildings with the wind coming from the south off the Sea Islands, pushing it northwest toward the main house. 40 people formed a bucket line from the well. Dale Pruitt shouted orders that no one followed particularly well. Harlan stood on the back steps of the manor in his nightclothes, watching the east side of his property burn against the night sky of Colleton County, the glow visible from Walterboro, people later said, from over a mile away. The fire was contained before it reached the main house. The east building was a total loss. 2 smaller structures were significantly damaged. The financial impact was severe. The investigation the following morning found no definitive cause. The wood was dry. The cotton debris was highly combustible. Accidents happen on a working plantation in the heat of a South Carolina summer. But here is what was noted in the official record, and what was whispered about far more in the days that followed. At no point during the fire, or in the chaos that surrounded it, was Miriam seen by anyone. She was not at the bucket line. She was not standing with the others watching the fire. She was not in her cabin when it was checked the following morning. She simply was not there. And so the question that hung over Whitmore Manor in the days after the fire, unspoken, unresolved, sharp as a splinter, was the one that Harlan himself wrote in his private journal in a hand less steady than usual. Was it accident? Or was it a choice made by someone who understood fire the way they understood everything else on this property, better than I ever did? We want to stop here and ask you directly, what do you think happened that night in Colleton County, South Carolina? Was the fire an accident? Or was it something far more deliberate? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This story is just getting started, and your voice is part of it. The autumn of 1847 arrived in the South Carolina Low Country with an unusual chill. By October, the Spanish moss that draped the live oaks along the drive of Whitmore Manor had turned from silver green to grey, and the mornings carried a mist that rose from the wetlands and didn't burn off until nearly noon. The cotton harvest had been completed under compromised conditions. The loss of the East Storage Building had disrupted the entire processing operation, and a portion of the crop had been damaged before it could be properly handled. The financial damage was not catastrophic, but it was real, and in a world where a man's standing was measured in land, crop yield, and the perception of absolute control, even a visible crack carried enormous weight. Harlan Whitmore's world was full of cracks now. The search for Miriam had produced nothing. She had vanished from Whitmore Manor as completely as if the South Carolina marshes had simply absorbed her. Dale Pruitt had ridden to neighboring properties in Colton County, asking questions. Inquiries had been sent to the sheriff in Walterboro. A notice had been placed with the Charleston market through which Harlan had originally purchased her. Nothing came back. What did come back in the weeks following the fire were debts. Harlan had borrowed significantly against the expected harvest to finance the expansion of the West Wing the previous spring. The damaged crop, combined with the cost of rebuilding the East Storage Building, had pushed him into a position he had never in his life experienced. He owed more than he could immediately pay. The man in Walterboro to whom he owed the largest sum, a banker named Reeves, originally from Columbia, South Carolina, was not a patient creditor. And then came Thomas. On a cold Wednesday morning in November, Harlan came downstairs to find his son seated at the dining room table with a leather traveling bag at his feet and a look on his face that Harlan recognized immediately. Because it was the same look he had seen on Catherine's face the last time she had argued with him, 17 years before. The look of someone who has already made a decision and is only now delivering it. Thomas told his father that he was leaving Whitmore Manor, that he could not remain on a property that operated the way it did, that his time in Charleston and his conversations over the past months, here he did not mention Ezra by name, but Harlan's jaw tightened visibly, had made it impossible for him to continue as though nothing he had seen was real. He told his father that he was traveling north, to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where a contact from his college days had offered him a position with a shipping firm that dealt in manufactured goods rather than agricultural commodities. And he told his father that he was not leaving alone. The woman's name was Sarah. She was 22 years old, enslaved on the Whitmore property since the age of 6, and she had been the person Thomas had fallen in love with quietly and irreversibly over the preceding 2 years. He told his father this in the dining room of Whitmore Manor in Colleton County, South Carolina, in the year 1847, with the traveling bag at his feet and the mist still sitting over the cotton fields outside the window. What followed was the worst argument in the history of that house. Voices carried through the walls. Harlan's fist came down on the dining room table once, hard enough to rattle the candlesticks. But when it was over, Thomas picked up his bag, walked out the black front doors of Whitmore Manor, helped Sarah up onto the seat of a hired wagon, and drove north on the road toward Walterboro, and from there toward a life that the laws of South Carolina in 1847 said could not exist. Harlan watched from the window of his study until the wagon disappeared. He did not come out of that room for the rest of the day. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor moved carefully. She had made her decision about the letters in the chest before the fire, and the fire had only made her more certain. She copied the most critical passages in her own hand, sealed them in an envelope, and arranged a meeting, through a merchant she trusted in Walterboro, with Reverend James Alderton, the pastor of the African Methodist Episcopal congregation that served the free black community of Colleton County. Reverend Alderton was a careful man, a former resident of Charleston who had moved to the Low Country after the church there was burned in 1822 following the Denmark Vesey uprising, an event that had cast a long shadow over the spiritual life of black South Carolinians for decades. He read Eleanor's copies of the letters slowly in the small back office of his church while Eleanor waited. When he was finished, he looked up at her. "You understand what you've done by bringing these to me," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's why I'm here." What happened next unfolded over the following month with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a river in flood. Reverend Alderton shared the information carefully with deliberate people in deliberate places. It reached a lawyer in Beaufort, South Carolina, a man with connections to a growing network of abolitionists operating through the Sea Islands. It reached a free black man in Charleston who was, it turned out, the grandson of the original Beaumont patriarch who had lost the land decades before. And eventually, in a way that Harlan could not fully trace or stop, it reached the kind of official attention that money could delay, but not permanently silence. Harlan's name and the name Whitmore began appearing in conversations in Walterboro that he was not part of. And through all of this, the financial pressure, the departure of his son, the spreading scandal, Ezra was still on the property, still managing the daily operations with the same quiet precision, still rising before dawn, still keeping the ledgers that Harlan depended on, until the night of the first hard freeze of the winter of 1847. On that night, Ezra was gone. Not dramatically, not with confrontation. He was simply there at the end of the workday, and not there the following morning. His cabin was clean and empty in a way that suggested he had been preparing for some time. The plantation ledgers were in perfect order on the desk in the estate office, every account balanced, every entry complete, up to and including that day. And with them, in an envelope addressed in Ezra's careful, self-taught handwriting to no one in particular, were documents, records of transactions, evidence of certain financial irregularities in the Whitmore estate that, combined with Eleanor's letters, created a picture that no lawyer in South Carolina would be able to easily set aside. Harlan found the envelope himself. He stood in the estate office in the thin winter light of a Colleton County morning, reading through what Ezra had left behind, and for a long time he did not move. Then he walked through the house, through the rooms he had expanded, past the portraits of his father and grandfather on the staircase wall, through the kitchen where the fire was already lit, out the back and across the frost-hard ground toward the chapel at the rear of the property. He pushed open the door. The chapel smelled of cold wood and old candle wax. The 4 pews were empty. The simple cross above the door cast a long, thin shadow across the floor in the morning light. Harlan knelt. He stayed there for what those who later described the scene said was a very long time, long enough for the frost on the ground outside to begin melting in the late morning sun, long enough for the sounds of the property, the few remaining workers, the creak of the trees, the distant movement of water from the marshes, to come and go and come again. When he rose, his face, by the account of the young houseworker who saw him walk back, was not the face of a man who had been comforted. It was the face of a man who had knocked on a door and found nothing on the other side. The legal proceedings against Harlan Whitmore began in the spring of 1848. They were complicated by the laws of the state and slowed by the deliberate inefficiencies of a legal system designed to protect men like him, but they did not stop. The Beaumont family, through their Charleston representative, filed a formal claim. Reverend Alderton's network ensured that the story reached publications in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Boston, Massachusetts, where it was reprinted in abolitionist papers under the headline, "The Fraud of the Low Country: How a Carolina Colonel Built His Fortune on Stolen Ground." Thomas read the article in Philadelphia. He did not return to South Carolina. Eleanor left Whitmore Manor in the winter of 1848 with a single trunk and an address in Beaufort, South Carolina, the coastal town where the Sea Islands began, where the Gullah community had held its ground for generations, where the wind off the Atlantic carried, if you knew how to listen, something that sounded almost like a particular kind of endurance. Harlan Whitmore died in 1851. The cause was recorded as heart failure. He was 57 years old. He died in the manor, in the study on the second floor, in a house that by then employed fewer than a dozen people and had begun to show, in the peeling paint of its great white columns and the spreading moss on its steps, the first visible signs of a long decline. He was buried in the churchyard of First Baptist Church of Walterboro in the front section, as befitted a man of his former standing. The inscription on his stone was simple. It gave his name, his dates, and a single line from the Book of Proverbs. No one in the county could quite remember in later years who had chosen it. And Miriam? She was never officially found. No record exists of her recapture or her death. There are, however, accounts passed down through the Gullah communities of the South Carolina Sea Islands, preserved in the oral tradition that survived everything that was thrown against it, of a woman who appeared in the late 1840s in the communities along the coast between Beaufort and Edisto Island, a woman who knew plants and remedies and the old ways of reading the sky, a woman who, when asked where she came from, said only that she had come from a place that no longer existed in the form it had taken, and that this was entirely as it should be. Whitmore Manor stood for another 40 years after Harlan's death. It burned to the ground in 1891, cause undetermined. The land returned, through a legal process that took decades longer than it should have, to the descendants of the Beaumont family. The chapel at the rear of the property was the only structure that survived the fire. It still stands today, or so they say, in the low country of South Carolina. Small, whitewashed, the cross above the door weathered but intact. The wood inside still carries the faint smell of coal and candle wax. And if you go there on a still morning, when the mist is rising off the Edisto and the herons are standing motionless in the shallows, and you push open the door and step inside, the silence you find is the most complete silence you have ever heard in your life. Not peaceful, just empty, exactly as she said it would be. To everyone who stayed with this story from the very beginning, thank you, truly. What you just did, giving your time and your attention to a chapter of history that is painful, complicated, and essential, that is not a small thing. Stories like this one survive because people like you choose to hear them. The world of the South Carolina Low Country in 1847 was real. The structures of power, the quiet resistance, the courage of people who had every reason to give up and didn't. All of it was real. We built this story as fiction, but we built it with deep respect for the truth underneath it. And we want you to know the best is still ahead. What comes next in this channel will challenge you, move you, and remind you of things about human nature that are worth remembering. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the historical realities of the slavery era in the American South. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional. The historical context, the plantation system of South Carolina, the Gullah communities of the Sea Islands, the legal and social structures of the antebellum period, is grounded in documented history. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know what moved you, what surprised you, and what questions this story left you with. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and watch the next recommended video, because the story we have waiting for you next is one you will not want to miss.